The first time I realized my neighbor Karen had an unhealthy obsession with me was when she showed up at my front porch at 7 a.m. with a printed sheet of Wi-Fi names from her phone. She stood there in a pink robe, hair in rollers, clutching her mug of herbal tea like a gavel, pointing at the page as if she was presenting evidence in a murder trial. "This," she announced, her voice sharp enough to cut the morning air, "is harassment." I blinked at her, still groggy from my coffee not kicking in yet, and asked her what in the world she was talking about. She shoved the paper at me. My Wi-Fi network name, which I'd cheekily set as HOA sucks, was circled in red marker 3 times, like some detective cracking a code. "This is targeted at me," she hissed. "Everyone knows I'm on the HOA board. This is defamation. You'll take it down or face consequences." I almost laughed right then, but I managed to keep a straight face. To me, a Wi-Fi name was just a harmless joke, a small rebellion against her constant HOA memos about grass length and mailbox paint shade. To Karen, though, it was apparently a direct act of war. I calmly told her that she had no jurisdiction over my router, and that she should probably invest her energy in something more meaningful, like yoga or therapy. She gasped like I'd slapped her, then stormed off, declaring she would handle this through official channels. By official channels, Karen meant sliding poorly typed complaint letters under my door, signed with her oversized signature, and threatening vague legal action. The first one demanded that I change my Wi-Fi name immediately to something appropriate for a family neighborhood. The second one escalated, calling my choice psychological warfare against the HOA. The third one came with a scribbled note at the bottom, "Last warning before legal action." I kept each of these in a folder labeled Karen's Greatest Hits, partly for my own amusement, partly because I suspected they'd come in handy someday. One evening, I was grilling in the backyard when my other neighbor, Tom, wandered over with a beer in hand. He had heard through the grapevine that Karen was on a crusade against me. Apparently, she'd been knocking on doors, telling everyone I was conducting cyberbullying through my Wi-Fi. Tom, a retired cop, thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. He suggested I change the name again, just to really get under her skin. That's when inspiration struck. The next day, I renamed my network to Karen__stay off my lawn. The reaction was immediate and glorious. Within hours, Karen was pounding on my door again, this time with her teenage son reluctantly in tow. She pointed at the boy and yelled, "You're traumatizing my family. He can't concentrate on his homework with your abusive Wi-Fi taunting us every night." The kid rolled his eyes so hard I thought they might fall out. I asked him if my network name genuinely affected his algebra homework. He muttered, "No, Mom," but Karen cut him off and threatened once again to take me to court. I told her to go ahead. A week later, a certified letter arrived. It was from a local attorney, who, to my amazement, had actually agreed to represent her. The letter accused me of defamation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I read it 3 times, each time laughing harder, before finally calling the lawyer's office to make sure this wasn't a prank. The receptionist confirmed it was real. That was the moment I knew this was about to get entertaining. Karen's lawsuit became the talk of the neighborhood. People would stop me on my evening walks, half laughing, half curious, asking if it was true that she was dragging me into court over Wi-Fi. Some of them even admitted to renaming their own networks just to annoy her further. Within a week, we had networks popping up like Karen Can't Stop Us, HOA Overlords, and my personal favorite, Free Therapy for Karen. She was losing her mind, and I was living rent-free in her head. But as much as I enjoyed the chaos, I also knew lawsuits weren't cheap, even when you're confident you'll win. I hired my own attorney, a sharp guy named Michael who looked like he thrived on ridiculous cases like this. When I showed him the complaint, he smirked and said, "Well, this is going to be fun. Don't worry, she doesn't have a leg to stand on. But we'll play it smart." That was exactly what I wanted. A calm professional who could turn this nonsense into Karen's own undoing. Our first hearing was just a preliminary scheduling conference, but Karen showed up dressed like she was auditioning for a legal drama, complete with a pearl necklace and an oversized binder labeled Evidence. She glared at me across the room, whispering furiously to her lawyer. When the judge asked her side to summarize the case, her attorney launched into a speech about how my Wi-Fi names were destroying Karen's peace of mind, humiliating her in front of her neighbors, and creating a hostile environment in her own home. The judge actually tilted his head like he wasn't sure if this was a joke. My lawyer, with perfect comedic timing, said, "Your Honor, the defense will be that my client is allowed to name his own Wi-Fi. That's it." The judge tried not to laugh, but I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. Afterward, Karen stormed out of the courthouse and cornered me in the parking lot, hissing that I'd regret mocking her. I calmly told her that the First Amendment was a beautiful thing, and that maybe she should spend less time worrying about my router and more time fixing her own. She stomped away, nearly tripping over the curb in her heels. The weeks that followed were a blur of depositions and filings. Karen demanded damages for public humiliation, which was hilarious because she was the one broadcasting this drama to the entire neighborhood. She even produced screenshots of my Wi-Fi names as exhibits, with dramatic captions like Exhibit A, Targeted Harassment. Meanwhile, more neighbors joined the fun, setting their Wi-Fi names to things like Karen files lawsuits and Objection overruled. It became a community sport. I think some people who didn't even live nearby joined in just for the entertainment. The tension built toward the first actual courtroom appearance. Karen told anyone who would listen that she was going to set a legal precedent and that I would be forced to issue a public apology. I smiled politely every time she made those declarations, knowing that she was digging herself deeper into a hole she couldn't climb out of. My lawyer prepped me for everything, assuring me that the judge would likely toss the case before it even went to trial. Still, I couldn't shake the thrill of anticipation. Something about the absurdity of the whole thing, the idea that a grown woman was trying to weaponize the court system over Wi-Fi names, was so surreal that I almost enjoyed the hassle. And deep down, I knew the best was yet to come. By the time our court date arrived, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread far beyond the neighborhood. Even local reporters showed up, curious about the case. Karen strutted in like she owned the place, clutching her evidence binder and glaring at me with the fire of 1,000 suns. I leaned back in my seat, calm as ever, ready to watch her implode in front of everyone. And as the judge entered and called the case, I realized I'd stumbled into something rare. A petty neighborhood feud that had transformed into a full-blown public spectacle. Karen thought she was about to win a war. She had no idea she was about to become a punchline. Courtrooms have a certain smell to them, like dust, old wood, and recycled air. I remember sitting there at the plaintiff's table, watching Karen fumble with her binder of evidence, as if she were about to expose Watergate. Her lawyer looked exhausted already, flipping through pages that had clearly been organized by someone who thought highlighter color dictated legal weight. Across the aisle, my attorney Michael leaned back, arms crossed, wearing the same expression a cat wears when it knows the mouse is running straight into the trap. The judge began by asking Karen's lawyer to state the claims. He cleared his throat and launched into a melodramatic monologue about ongoing emotional distress inflicted by the defendant through malicious digital conduct. The man actually said, "malicious digital conduct," with a straight face. Karen nodded furiously, whispering yes under her breath like a preacher's assistant. I resisted the urge to raise my hand and ask if my router was now classified as a weapon of mass destruction. Then came Karen's moment to shine. The judge allowed her to explain, in her own words, why she believed I was guilty of harassment. She stood up, clutched her pearls, and declared, "Every night when I open my laptop, I am assaulted by names that demean me, names that make me the laughingstock of my community." She fanned herself dramatically as though my Wi-Fi signals were radiating toxic waves directly at her. "It has caused me sleepless nights, public embarrassment and," she glanced at her son, who had been forced into the front row, irreversible trauma to my family. The kid groaned audibly, earning a stern look from his mother. Michael stood, calm and deliberate, and said, "Your Honor, at no point did my client force the plaintiff to connect to his Wi-Fi. At no point did he target her directly. The plaintiff is simply offended by the fact that she can read words. Last I checked, the First Amendment protects words, even on a router." The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. I could tell he was fighting the same urge to laugh that I was. The hearing should have ended there. Any rational person would have realized they were out of their depth. But Karen wasn't rational. She demanded that her exhibits be reviewed. She slid a stack of screenshots toward the judge, pictures of my Wi-Fi names, printed in full color, each labeled in block letters like Exhibit A, Threat. One of them was, Karen _ stay off my lawn. Another was, HO overlords. She even included Tom's contribution, free therapy for Karen, despite the fact that it wasn't mine. Michael objected immediately, pointing out that my neighbor's Wi-Fi names had nothing to do with me. The judge raised an eyebrow and asked Karen how she could possibly prove those belonged to me. She sputtered, insisting I must have allied with other neighbors in a conspiracy. At that point, the gallery, neighbors, random curious citizens, even a couple of reporters, snickered openly. The bailiff had to call for order. That was the moment I realized Karen had crossed the line from nuisance to spectacle. This wasn't just about me anymore. She had made herself the town's entertainment. People were live tweeting from the courtroom. One guy in the back was discreetly filming her meltdown on his phone, probably imagining his clip would end up on the evening news. The judge scheduled a formal hearing for the following month, making it clear he had no intention of tossing the case yet, but also no patience for Karen's theatrics. As we left, Michael leaned over and whispered, "Don't worry. The longer this drags out, the worse she looks." Outside, reporters swarmed Karen, asking her why she thought a Wi-Fi name constituted harassment. She puffed up like a blowfish and announced she was taking a stand against cyberbullying. I almost choked on my water bottle. Meanwhile, neighbors clapped me on the back, grinning, as if I had become the folk hero who'd finally given Karen the spotlight she'd always craved, for all the wrong reasons. That week, the neighborhood transformed into open rebellion. New Wi-Fi names sprang up like mushrooms after rain. Karen can't sue us all, router freedom, defendant strong. Even the sweet old couple 2 houses down, who had never owned a smartphone until their grandson bought them one, joined in. Their network appeared as Go Home Karen. It was glorious. I hadn't seen this level of community unity since the block barbecue 10 years ago. Ironically, Karen had done what no HOA meeting ever managed. She'd united the neighborhood against herself. Karen, of course, doubled down. She began patrolling the sidewalks, snapping photos of houses, claiming she was documenting criminal intent. One afternoon, she stood in front of my driveway with a tape recorder, loudly narrating her grievances like she was compiling a true crime podcast. "The defendant continues his harassment campaign," she muttered into the mic, "and now others have joined his unlawful conspiracy." When she noticed me watching from the porch, she wagged a finger and shouted, "This will all be presented in court." I shouted back, "Make sure to get my good side." Tom nearly fell off his lawn chair laughing. The legal process trudged forward. Karen's lawyer, who looked like he regretted every career choice leading him here, sent discovery requests demanding my router logs, screenshots of my Wi-Fi settings, even proof of when I last updated my password. Michael responded with icy professionalism, refusing anything irrelevant and reminding them that Karen had no legal ground. Behind the scenes, he confided that the opposing counsel had already tried to convince Karen to settle quietly, but she insisted on making history. As the second hearing approached, tension in the neighborhood reached a fever pitch. People started taking bets on how spectacularly the case would collapse. Someone even set up a Facebook group titled Wi-Fi Freedom Watch, where updates from the courtroom were shared like battle reports. Karen lurked in the comments, defending herself under obviously fake profiles with names like Justice Warrior 99. Screenshots of her arguing with random strangers circulated, fueling the fire. The day of the next hearing, the courtroom was standing room only. The judge had clearly had enough. He cut off Karen's lawyer halfway through his opening statement and asked him, point blank, "Counselor, are you seriously asking this court to police Wi-Fi names?" There was a pause so heavy you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Finally, the lawyer muttered, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge pinched the bridge of his nose. Then it was Michael's turn. He calmly laid out the basics. No law prohibits naming a private Wi-Fi network anything you want, as long as it's not inciting violence or making direct threat. He pointed out that Karen's supposed damages were self-inflicted, since no one forced her to look at the networks, and she had been the one broadcasting the issue to the neighborhood. The best part was when he held up Karen's own letters, those overblown complaints she had slipped under my door. "If anything, Your Honor, my client has been harassed by the plaintiff," he said. The judge nodded thoughtfully. Karen tried to interject, insisting that her reputation had been destroyed. The judge silenced her with a gavel. "Ma'am, you've done more damage to your own reputation than any Wi-Fi name could." Laughter rippled through the courtroom, and this time the judge didn't bother hiding his smirk. Karen's idea of losing gracefully was about as realistic as her belief that a Wi-Fi signal could ruin her son's homework. After the judge's thinly veiled laughter in the last hearing, most sane people would have cut their losses. Not Karen. No, she marched straight out of that courtroom, cornered a reporter from the local paper, and declared that this was the civil rights case of our generation. By the time I got home that night, there was already an online article titled, "Neighborhood Feud Over Wi-Fi Heads to Court," complete with a photo of Karen pointing furiously at me in the courthouse parking lot. Naturally, the internet did what the internet does best. Within hours, the article went viral on social media. Comment sections filled with strangers weighing in, most of them laughing at Karen's plight. Memes started circulating with captions like, "First they came for our Wi-Fi, and I said nothing," and "Live, laugh, lawsuit." Someone even mocked up a fake Netflix poster for The Wi-Fi Wars, starring Karen as a villainous overlord. It was absurd, but also, somehow, exactly what Karen wanted. She craved attention, and even though the spotlight made her look like a fool, she embraced it like a queen accepting her crown. Of course, the newfound fame didn't improve her behavior. If anything, it supercharged it. Karen doubled down on her war against me, convinced she was on the brink of making legal history. She started holding impromptu press conferences on her front lawn, complete with poster boards of my Wi-Fi names. At one of them, she dramatically pointed to a blown-up screenshot of Karen__stay off my lawn, while declaring, "This is cyberbullying. This is harassment. This is tyranny in our very neighborhoods." I stood on my porch across the street, sipping coffee, giving a little wave to the handful of bored onlookers who had gathered just to laugh. It didn't stop there. Karen began patrolling the neighborhood at night, snapping photos of houses whose Wi-Fi names she deemed suspicious. She'd email these to her lawyer with subject lines like, "New evidence of conspiracy." One morning, Tom showed me a copy of what she'd slipped under his door. It was a cease and desist letter written in Comic Sans, accusing him of joining my harassment campaign by naming his network Free Therapy for Karen. Tom laughed so hard he framed it and hung it in his garage. While Karen was busy torching her own credibility, Michael and I quietly built our case. He filed a motion for summary judgment, essentially asking the judge to dismiss the lawsuit outright on the grounds that it had no legal basis. Karen's lawyer opposed it, but you could tell his heart wasn't in it. Rumor had it he was already begging her to drop the case. Still, Karen was determined. She announced at yet another press conference that she would bring in expert witnesses to prove the psychological harm caused by Wi-Fi harassment. When the day of the summary judgment hearing arrived, the courtroom was packed again, this time with even more spectators. Reporters, neighbors, even a few college students who probably came for extra credit in their law class. Karen strutted in, dragging a wheeled suitcase stuffed with binders, as if she were presenting at a national security summit. Her lawyer trailed behind, looking like a man on the verge of retirement. The hearing began with Michael's argument. Calm, precise, devastating. He laid out the law in simple terms. No statute, no precedent, nothing in the history of American jurisprudence supported Karen's claim. At the end of the day, Your Honor, he concluded, this case is about someone being offended by words they voluntarily looked at. That does not constitute harassment. The judge nodded, clearly in agreement. Then Karen demanded to speak. Despite her lawyer's protests, she insisted on being heard. She marched to the podium, clutching a stack of papers, and began a speech that could have been pulled straight from a conspiracy blog. She accused me of masterminding a neighborhood-wide harassment campaign, claimed the Wi-Fi signals were giving her migraines, and even suggested that my router was intentionally positioned to beam insults directly into her bedroom. She waved a chart around, something she'd obviously printed off Google, that showed radio waves bouncing off walls. "See," she shouted. "It's a targeted attack." The gallery erupted in laughter. The judge banged his gavel, demanding silence, but even he couldn't keep a straight face. Michael leaned over and whispered, "At this point, we don't even need to win. She's winning it for us." The judge didn't rule immediately. Instead, he set a trial date, explaining that while the claims seemed dubious, he wanted to give Karen her full day in court before making a final judgment. Karen took this as a victory, parading out of the courtroom like she'd just conquered Rome. The rest of us knew it was just prolonging her humiliation. In the weeks leading up to trial, Karen escalated to new heights of absurdity. She tried to collect affidavits from neighbors, but most of them refused, or worse, mocked her to her face. One neighbor submitted an affidavit in crayon that simply read, "Karen is nuts," with a smiley face. Karen didn't realize she was being trolled and triumphantly added it to her evidence binder. Meanwhile, the local news stations latched onto the story. They interviewed me on my front lawn, asking how I felt about being sued over Wi-Fi. I kept my answers calm, measured, even a little sarcastic. "I suppose this is the first time in history someone's been accused of cyberbullying through router names," I said. "If that makes me a pioneer, so be it." The clip went viral, and overnight I went from neighborhood folk hero to minor internet celebrity. Karen, furious at my media manipulation, held her own press event, accusing me of using the press to smear her. It didn't help that she chose to do it while wearing a bedazzled visor and holding a megaphone that kept squeaking with feedback. The footage made the evening news under the headline, "Local Woman Declares War on Wi-Fi." The night before the trial, I sat on my porch with Tom and a few other neighbors. We sipped beers and speculated about what new disaster Karen would unleash in the courtroom. One neighbor joked about bringing popcorn. Another suggested we start a neighborhood pool to bet on how quickly the judge would dismiss the case. For me, it wasn't about the win anymore. It was about watching Karen's obsession implode in the most public way possible. When trial day arrived, the courthouse was buzzing like it was hosting a celebrity case. Reporters lined the steps, photographers snapped pictures, and random people who had nothing better to do filed inside just for the show. Karen arrived with her suitcase of binders, now decorated with stickers that said things like "Justice for HOA" and "Stop Cyberbullying." Her lawyer trailed behind, pale and resigned. As I sat at the defense table, calm and collected, I realized something important. Karen didn't want to win. She wanted a stage. She wanted the spotlight, no matter how humiliating it was. And tomorrow, she was going to get exactly what she wanted, just not in the way she imagined. The trial began like something out of a parody courtroom drama. The judge entered with his usual composure, but the gallery buzzed with so much anticipation that he had to pound his gavel 3 times before the room quieted. Karen sat at her table, dressed in what she must have thought was a power suit, neon green with padded shoulders big enough to take flight. Her suitcase of binders sat beside her like a loyal guard dog. Her lawyer looked pale, almost translucent, as though he were already bracing for professional embarrassment. Michael leaned over to me and whispered, "All we have to do is keep her talking. She'll do the work for us." That was his strategy in a nutshell. My job was to stay calm, stay quiet, and let Karen bury herself in her own nonsense. The prosecution began with their opening statement. Karen's lawyer spoke in monotone, reading directly from his notes about how I had waged a campaign of harassment and humiliation through my Wi-Fi names. He used words like trauma, psychological harm, and cyberbullying, but the delivery was so lifeless it was almost as if he were reading a grocery list. When he finished, Karen jumped up and tried to add her own comments, insisting the jury needed to hear from her as the victim. The judge allowed her 2 minutes. She used them to rail against me personally, pointing her finger at me like a villain in a children's play and declaring that I had made her life a living hell. Michael's opening, by contrast, was crisp and surgical. He reminded the jury of the law, the First Amendment, and the absence of any actual evidence of harassment. "The plaintiff is offended by words she voluntarily reads," he said plainly. "That is not harassment. That is choice." He then promised the jury that what they would see over the coming days was not evidence of a crime, but evidence of obsession. The room fell silent as he returned to his seat. It was clear which side had made the stronger impression. The first witness Karen called was her teenage son. He shuffled to the stand, hands in his pockets, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Karen's lawyer asked him how the Wi-Fi names had affected him. The kid muttered, "They haven't." Karen gasped audibly. The lawyer tried again, prompting him with, "Do you feel targeted or unsafe when you see the network names?" The boy shrugged. "It's just Wi-Fi, dude. I don't even look at it." Laughter rippled through the gallery. Karen buried her face in her hands, as though her own son had betrayed her. Next, Karen produced what she called her expert witness, a self-proclaimed digital wellness coach she'd found online. The man strutted in wearing a silk scarf and started lecturing the jury about toxic frequencies and emotional resonance fields. He held up a crystal and claimed it absorbed negative router energy. Michael objected before the man could go further, arguing that the witness wasn't a qualified expert. The judge sustained the objection, striking his testimony from the record. The gallery erupted again, this time with barely contained laughter. By the time Karen herself took the stand, the jury was already skeptical. She spoke for nearly an hour, waving charts, handing out binders, and dramatically recounting the sleepless nights she'd endured. She claimed she'd developed migraines, anxiety, and even digestive problems from seeing my Wi-Fi names pop up. She accused me of conspiring with half the neighborhood, of launching a coordinated psychological war. At one point, she held up a page with dozens of Wi-Fi names, many of which weren't even mine, and shouted, "This is proof of a hate campaign." Michael stood for cross-examination. He began by asking one simple question. "Mrs. Caldwell, do you have the ability to change your own Wi-Fi settings so that you do not see other networks?" Karen froze. She hadn't expected that. "Well, yes, but that's not the point," she stammered. Michael pressed further. "So you could have hidden the networks, ignored them, or even moved your router. But instead, you chose to screenshot them, print them, and distribute them to your neighbors and the press." Karen's face flushed. "I had no choice," she said weakly. "It was harassment." Michael delivered the final blow. "So the only one broadcasting these names to the world was you." That line hung in the air like a thunderclap. The jury exchanged knowing looks. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. Karen sputtered, but the damage was done. After court adjourned that day, the internet exploded again. Reporters who had attended the trial wasted no time posting headlines like "Plaintiff admits to broadcasting own evidence" and "Wi-Fi harassment trial goes off the rails." Clips of Karen waving her charts circulated on Twitter, TikTok, everywhere. She became a meme overnight. One video of her shouting "targeted attack" at a screenshot of Wi-Fi networks hit 1 million views by the next morning. Despite the humiliation, Karen still refused to back down. The following day, she arrived with even more binders and tried to introduce new evidence, a series of handwritten letters from herself, claiming additional damages. The judge refused to admit them. Her lawyer's frustration boiled over. He slammed his briefcase shut, told the judge he could no longer represent her, and walked out of the courtroom. Gasps filled the gallery. Karen stood frozen, abandoned in the middle of her crusade. The judge gave her the option of continuing on her own, and, true to form, she did. Representing herself only made the circus worse. She began shouting objections at random, interrupting witnesses, and accusing the jury of bias. At one point she pointed at me and screamed, "He's hacking me right now." The judge ordered a recess just to calm the room down. Michael didn't even need to present much of a defense. Karen was dismantling her own case one outburst at a time. By the end of the week, it was clear how things would end. Michael delivered a closing argument that was short, logical, and devastatingly effective. This case was never about harassment, he told the jury. It was about one person's obsession. The plaintiff has turned a private joke into a public spectacle. And now she asks you to reward her for it. Don't. Karen's closing argument, on the other hand, was a rant that careened from accusations of hacking to claims that Wi-Fi names were the new frontier of psychological warfare. She spoke for nearly 40 minutes, ignoring the judge's attempts to rein her in. By the time she finished, the jury looked exhausted. As the court recessed before deliberation, I caught Michael's eye. He gave me a slight nod, the kind of nod that said, "We've already won." Still, part of me wondered just how spectacular the verdict would be. Would the jury simply dismiss her claims, or would they go further? That night, I barely slept. Not because I was nervous, but because I knew the next day would be the climax of months of absurdity. The jury would render its verdict, and Karen, for all her bluster, was about to face the consequences of her obsession in the most public way imaginable. The morning of the verdict felt like the air itself was charged with anticipation. I drove to the courthouse through streets unusually busy for a weekday, realizing halfway there that I wasn't the only one who sensed the coming spectacle. By the time I arrived, the steps of the courthouse were crowded with reporters, neighborhood gawkers, and even a few opportunists selling popcorn from a cooler. A handmade sign hung off a lamppost reading, "Wi-Fi Freedom Rally." I parked a block away and strolled past it all with my usual calm, a half-smile tugging at my lip. If Karen had wanted attention, she had certainly gotten it, just not the kind she'd expected. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder. College students, retirees, neighbors, and journalists jostled for seat. Even the bailiff shook his head, as if to say he couldn't believe he was working security for a case about Wi-Fi names. Karen arrived in a dramatic red blazer that clashed violently with her lipstick. She wheeled her suitcase of binders like a prized exhibit, though everyone knew the jury had already tuned her out days ago. Without her lawyer, she strutted around like she was both prosecutor and star witness, waving to the reporters as if she were a celebrity. Michael leaned over and whispered, "Don't react, no matter what she says when the verdict is read." I nodded. At this point, I was almost looking forward to the show more than the decision itself. The judge entered, bringing the courtroom to order. He read through the procedural motions briskly, then instructed the jury foreman to rise. The room fell silent, so silent I could hear Karen's heavy breathing from across the aisle. The foreman cleared his throat and delivered the words that sealed the entire ordeal. "We find in favor of the defendant. The plaintiff's claims are dismissed in their entirety." The gallery erupted. Applause, cheers, even laughter filled the room. The judge banged his gavel furiously, demanding order, but the atmosphere was uncontrollable. Karen stood frozen, her face pale, her jaw trembling. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. When she finally managed a sound, it was a strangled cry of, "This isn't justice." She slammed her binder on the table, sending papers flying across the floor. The judge silenced her with a glare and said, "Ma'am, you have wasted this court's time and resources. This matter is concluded." Then he ordered her to pay my legal fees, a cherry on top that I hadn't even dared hope for. The gallery cheered again as Karen wailed, insisting she would appeal. The judge warned her one last time before leaving the bench. Outside, the courthouse steps became a carnival. Reporters thrust microphones in my face, asking how I felt about my victory. I kept it cool, offering measured words. I'm glad common sense prevailed. Freedom of expression, even something as silly as a Wi-Fi name, is worth defending. My soundbite was clipped, calm, and deliberate, the perfect contrast to Karen's meltdown. Karen, on the other hand, stormed past the reporters, screaming that the jury was corrupt, that I had hacked her evidence, that the entire court system was biased. The cameras caught every second of it. By the evening, her tantrum was plastered across every news channel, labeled Karen's Wi-Fi meltdown. I thought that would be the end of it, that Karen would crawl back into her HOA meetings and lick her wounds quietly. I underestimated her. The very next week, flyers appeared on neighborhood mailboxes advertising a community protest against Wi-Fi harassment, organized by none other than Karen herself. The flyer accused me of manipulating the court and promised a peaceful demonstration on my front lawn. Tom brought one over, doubled over with laughter. "She's rallying troops," he said between chuckles. "You'd think you were running an illegal casino, not a router." I decided not to interfere. If Karen wanted to embarrass herself again, I wasn't going to stop her. Sure enough, Saturday morning rolled around and a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk outside my house. Karen stood at the front, holding a megaphone that squealed with feedback every time she pressed the button. Behind her were maybe 10 people, mostly her HOA loyalists, holding signs that read things like "Stop cyberbullying" and "Protect our children from Wi-Fi." The rest of the onlookers were neighbors laughing, kids riding bikes, and a couple of news vans filming the absurdity. I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, giving the occasional wave. Karen shouted into her megaphone about how the legal system had failed and how she would take the case to higher courts. But every time she spoke, the neighbors drowned her out by holding up their phones and broadcasting the latest ridiculous Wi-Fi names they'd created. Karen lost big time, Wi-Fi champion 2025, justice served. At one point, someone pulled up with a Bluetooth speaker blasting, "We are the champions." The protest fizzled after an hour, dissolving into awkward silence as her own supporters slipped away. By noon, only Karen remained, standing alone with her sign, shouting at passing cars that ignored her. I felt almost sorry for her, almost. Michael called me later that day to say the judgment had been finalized and that Karen had 30 days to pay my legal fees. "If she doesn't," he said with a smirk in his voice, "we can garnish her wages." The thought of Karen working just to fund the man she tried to sue made me laugh harder than I had in months. But Karen wasn't done. Instead of paying, she filed motion after motion, each more ridiculous than the last. She claimed the jury had been bribed, that the judge was related to me, even that the bailiff had given me secret nods of encouragement. Each motion was denied, but she kept filing. It was as if she believed sheer persistence could bend reality to her will. The neighborhood, meanwhile, had turned my ordeal into legend. People would walk by and ask me to retell the story of the courtroom verdict. Kids chalked Wi-Fi puns on the sidewalk. Tom suggested hosting a block party called Wifest with free hot dogs and a banner that read "Signal Strong." Even the sweet old couple down the street joined in, renaming their network Karen Owes Money. What Karen didn't realize was that every move she made only fueled the story further. She thought she was rallying support, but really she was giving the neighborhood its best comedy material in years. And as much as I enjoyed the laughs, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't finished. People like Karen never truly quit. They just find new ways to escalate. And she was about to prove me right. Because the following week, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. Not from Karen directly, but from the state appellate court. Karen had filed an appeal. She was going to drag this battle out even longer. The envelope from the appellate court felt heavier than paper should. I stood in my kitchen, staring at it while the kettle hissed behind me, the steam curling like a warning. Karen had actually filed an appeal. After months of humiliation, after being laughed out of the courtroom, after owing me thousands in legal fees, she still believed she had a case. Or maybe she just couldn't stomach losing. Either way, she was about to drag us all through another round of insanity. Michael wasn't surprised when I called him. "She's delusional," he said flatly, "but appeals are her right. Don't worry. The appellate court won't waste much time on this. They'll either dismiss it outright or hold a brief hearing. Either way, her odds are 0. That reassured me somewhat, but I couldn't shake the sense that Karen wasn't in this for the odds. She was in it for the stage. The neighborhood reacted with a mix of outrage and glee. Outrage that she was wasting more taxpayer money, glee that the entertainment wasn't over yet. Tom suggested we hold a watch party for the appellate hearing. Another neighbor joked about printing T-shirts that read, "Appealed and Denied." Someone actually set up a projector on their garage door one evening, playing a slideshow of all the Wi-Fi names that had popped up since the feud began. Kids from down the street submitted entries like Router McCruiterface and Karen the Menace. It felt like the entire block had turned Karen's crusade into a community project. Karen, for her part, embraced her role as martyr. She started handing out flyers again, this time with slogans like "Justice Denied at Lower Court" and "Appeal for Freedom." She gave interviews to anyone who would listen, claiming her case was about protecting families from technological harassment. The reporters who covered her did so with thinly disguised amusement, their articles dripping with irony. But Karen either didn't notice or didn't care. To her, attention was victory. When the appellate hearing date arrived, I drove to the city courthouse with Michael. This was no small-town spectacle anymore. The appellate judges didn't have the patience of our local judge. They dealt with real cases, real stakes, and their docket was already packed. Ours was just a bizarre detour in their schedule. Karen showed up dressed like she was heading to a presidential debate. Navy suit, oversized flag pin, hair lacquered into a helmet. She wheeled her suitcase of binders again, though by now it was bulging so badly the zipper barely held. She marched into the courtroom with her chin high, as if she believed this was her big break. The judges, 3 of them, entered with an air of no-nonsense authority. The lead judge glanced at the case file, then at Karen, then at me. His expression was already skeptical. "We are here to hear Caldwell versus Parker," he said. "Plaintiff, you may present your argument." Karen launched into her speech, voice trembling with emotion but loud enough to echo. She accused the lower court of bias, claimed the jury was corrupted by neighborhood gossip, insisted that Wi-Fi names constituted targeted harassment under common decency laws. She waved her charts again, pointing dramatically to exhibits that the judges barely glanced at. One of them even leaned back, rubbing his temples as though a migraine was forming. Michael stood and countered with a simple statement. "Your Honors, the lower court correctly applied the law. There is no statute, no precedent, and no rational interpretation that supports the plaintiff's claims. This appeal is frivolous." He sat down, his confidence radiating. The judges conferred briefly. Then the lead judge spoke, his tone clipped. "We find no merit in this appeal. The lower court's decision is affirmed. Furthermore, we caution the plaintiff against filing further frivolous actions, as sanctions may apply." He banged the gavel, and just like that, it was over. The gallery, smaller than before but still dotted with curious neighbors, burst into applause. Karen stood frozen, clutching her binder like it was a life raft in a storm. Her face contorted as she realized she had lost again, this time in front of judges who hadn't even humored her. Outside, she faced reporters once more. "This isn't the end," she screamed into the microphones. "I will take this to the Supreme Court if I have to." The reporters laughed openly this time. Headlines that evening included gems like "Wi-Fi war hits dead end" and "Local woman loses again." Back in the neighborhood, the verdict was celebrated like a holiday. Tom fired up his grill and hosted an impromptu block party. People brought lawn chairs, kids ran around with sparklers, and someone set up a karaoke machine. At one point, a neighbor belted out "Another One Bites the Dust" to roars of laughter. My router, of course, broadcast a new name that night. Appeal denied. Karen sulked indoors for a few days, her blinds drawn, her yard unattended. Rumor had it she was refusing to pay the legal fees the court had ordered. Michael assured me the next step was simple. The court could garnish her wages or put a lien on her property. "It's not if you get paid," he said, "it's when." But just when I thought Karen had finally run out of steam, she found a new angle. She began claiming that I had been profiting off her misery. Technically, she wasn't wrong. With all the attention the story had gotten, I'd been invited onto a podcast, then another, then a local TV segment. I was careful not to mock her directly, but my sarcastic retelling of events made for irresistible content. My calm demeanor against her theatrics played perfectly for an audience hungry for absurd stories. I wasn't making millions, but the appearance fees and ad revenue were nothing to sneeze at. Karen latched onto that. She claimed I was exploiting her victimhood for financial gain, that I had orchestrated the entire saga just to become famous. She started threatening to sue me again, this time for defamation and profiteering. Michael laughed when I told him. "Let her try," he said. "The more she pushes, the more ridiculous she looks. At this point, she's fueling your career." And he wasn't wrong. The podcast appearances snowballed into speaking invitations, even a book proposal. Publishers wanted me to write about the Wi-Fi war, about the absurdity of modern entitlement, about how one woman's obsession had turned into a community legend. I agreed, partly for the money, partly because I knew Karen would hate it. When news of the book deal leaked, Karen nearly exploded. She marched up to my porch one afternoon, waving a copy of the contract she had somehow printed from the news article. "You can't do this," she shrieked. "You're using my name, my life, my pain." I sipped my coffee and said, "Actually, I'm using my Wi-Fi names. You just happened to star in the story." She screamed so loudly a dog barked 3 houses away. As she stomped off, I realized the truth. Karen wasn't going to stop. Not because she had a case, but because this was her identity now. She wasn't just Karen anymore. She was the woman who sued over Wi-Fi. She had fused herself to the spectacle, and letting go would mean admitting defeat not just in court, but in life. By the time Karen threatened to take her case to the Supreme Court, the neighborhood barely blinked. People were so used to her escalating theatrics that "Karen's at it again" had become the standard punchline whenever anything absurd happened. But I knew her well enough by now to understand she wasn't bluffing. She didn't care if the justices in Washington would laugh her out of the building, she just wanted the illusion of a fight. Michael called me the morning after her Supreme Court comments aired on local TV. He was laughing so hard he had to pause. "I'll save you the trouble," he said. "The Supreme Court doesn't take cases about Wi-Fi names. She can file whatever paperwork she wants. It'll be denied before it's even considered. She's a sideshow, not a precedent." His confidence reassured me, but I also knew that for Karen, denial wasn't the end, it was fuel. Sure enough, Karen organized what she called a March for Digital Justice. She printed flyers, rallied her few remaining HOA loyalists, and promised a grand demonstration on the courthouse steps downtown. The neighborhood, sensing free entertainment, treated it like a parade. On the morning of the march, People piled into cars, lawn chairs strapped to roofs, coolers full of soda, as if heading to a tailgate. When we arrived downtown, the sight was almost too surreal to process. Karen stood at the top of the courthouse steps with a megaphone, wearing a sash that read, "Justice Warrior." Beside her were 6 HOA diehards holding poster boards with slogans like, "Ban harassment Wi-Fi," and "Stop the signal." Across from them, at least 200 people, neighbors, students, random internet fans who had followed the story online, cheered and waved signs of their own. "Free the router," one read. Another, "Appeal denied forever." Someone even dressed up as a giant Wi-Fi router, complete with blinking lights, and danced around Karen's group like a mascot mocking the away team. News crews swarmed the scene. Karen shouted into her megaphone about how she was taking her battle to the highest court in the land, how this wasn't just about Wi-Fi names but about protecting the dignity of all citizens. Every time she raised her fist, the crowd jeered, laughing and chanting, "Strong signal, no appeal." Tom, standing beside me with a bag of popcorn, muttered, "I think she just lost whatever was left of her credibility." Michael appeared briefly, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe his career had come to this. "She's giving you more material for your book," he said dryly. "Be sure to thank her in the acknowledgments." Karen's march fizzled after an hour, her supporters slinking away as the crowd drowned her out with chants and laughter. By the end, she was left standing alone at the top of the courthouse steps, screaming about injustice into a megaphone that squeaked with feedback, while the news cameras zoomed in mercilessly. That night, the clip went viral. Headlines around the country mocked her. "Woman declares war on Wi-Fi again," "The router revolution no one asked for," "Supreme Court won't hear your Wi-Fi case, Karen." Late-night hosts joked about it. Memes flooded social media. Karen had become more than a neighborhood spectacle, she was a national punchline. But with that fame came consequences. The HOA board, already embarrassed by her antics, voted to remove her from her position. They sent out a statement distancing themselves from her actions, calling her lawsuit a misguided personal crusade. Neighbors who once tolerated her began avoiding her entirely. The woman who once strutted through the neighborhood like royalty now found herself isolated, her only companions the binders of evidence stacked inside her house. I thought maybe that would be the end. But Karen had one last gasp left in her. She filed for bankruptcy rather than pay the court-ordered legal fees. Michael called me with the update. "It doesn't matter," he said. "The lien on her house still stands. Sooner or later, you'll get your money." When word of the bankruptcy spread, the neighborhood's sympathy was non-existent. People were tired of her crusade, tired of the drama. Even her own son, now old enough to roll his eyes with surgical precision, muttered to a group of kids at the bus stop, "She ruined herself over Wi-Fi." That line made its way into the local paper, quoted under the headline, "Karen's war comes at a price." Meanwhile, my life took an unexpected turn. The book deal became a reality, the podcast appearances multiplied, and one evening I found myself on a national talk show recounting the saga. The host leaned in and asked, "So what did you call your Wi-Fi after the verdict?" I smirked and said, "Appeal denied 2.0. The audience roared with laughter, and I knew right then that Karen's obsession had unintentionally launched me into a strange sort of fame. But the real victory wasn't in the book sales or the interviews. It was in the way the neighborhood changed. For years, Karen had ruled with her HOA clipboard, nitpicking lawns and threatening fines. But after the lawsuit, the power shifted. People realized they didn't have to bow to her demands, that her authority was an illusion. Block parties returned. Kids chalked the sidewalks without fear of violations. Neighbors who once kept to themselves began banding together, united not just by Karen's antics, but by the realization that their community could thrive without her control. One evening, months after the appeal was denied, I sat on my porch watching the sunset. Tom joined me with 2 beers, handing me one without a word. Across the street, Karen's house sat dark, blinds drawn tight. She hadn't been seen much lately. Rumor had it she was selling the house, unable to keep up with the debts her lawsuit had created. Tom raised his bottle in a toast. "To freedom," he said. I clinked mine against his. "To Wi-Fi," I replied. We laughed, and for the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt peaceful. But here's the thing about Karen: people like her don't just disappear. Even if she moved away, even if she vanished from our block, I knew somewhere down the line she'd resurface. Maybe in another HOA, maybe in another courtroom, maybe shouting about a different imagined injustice. Because for Karen, entitlement wasn't just a habit, it was a lifestyle. As for me, I wasn't worried. I had my router, my freedom, and a story that would be told for years to come. The courtroom couldn't stop laughing at her, the judges couldn't stop dismissing her, and the neighborhood couldn't stop mocking her. In the end, Karen had given me everything I needed: a victory, a community, and a legend that would never fade. And the Wi-Fi name? It still makes me smile every time I log in. Karen __ still owes me.